Well, thank you very much for inviting me to moderate or participate of this discussion. I was quite excited to have the invitation. It was an opportunity for me to see work of Dora's that I hadn't seen since she made it in 2001, and to maybe try to think a little bit about the way in which an oeuvre that I followed relatively closely in the last 20 years or so, and sort of see this early-ish piece, and also to discover the work of Luke Fowler, which I didn't know at all. And so and I felt, as I started looking at the two films, I felt a little bit stumped. So because you know their sort of formal qualities are so different, and I felt I didn't really know how to generate what would be an actual conversation, as opposed to maybe posing questions to Dora and then posing questions to Luke, which would would make for a strange situation in this context. So I thought maybe well, focus and maybe you find some sort of common elements. And that will allow us maybe to sort of weave our way through both pieces. And so my first question, I guess, would be to say it's interesting for me, and I hope for you, the fact that both of these works in different ways evoke the classroom. You have the breathing lesson, and you have, in Luke's case, a grammar for listening. And I was curious about, what do you find interesting, from in the dynamics of the lesson? What do you why this particular choice of words, a grammar, for listening? What were you thinking of when you came up with this? This would be an opening question. If you don't like it, I can ask another.
I love it.
It's a good observation. What was going through my mind when you were stumped was you could have called Dora and asked her.
Uh-huh.
Because Dora and I go way back, having worked together in an academic context in Brussels here, or collaborated together. But we both share an interest in the works of R.D. Laing and INC psychiatry, and I think this was the starting point of a conversation that Dora and I had many years ago. But of course, there's connections and threads that go through a lot of our works, and I'm really excited to see the Joycean Society, which I actually haven't seen, but I feel that there's going to be a kind of kinship with particular works of mine about education, adult education, and literacy. But this is a meandering introduction to answer to your question about the classroom. And yeah, so those. To start with the title, Grammar for Listening, again, comes from this interest in R.D. Laing and David Cooper. And David Cooper wrote a book called A Grammar for Living, which was it's a kind of I don't think it's ever been republished because it was so disdained at the time for many reasons, but it basically attacked the nuclear family quite vociferously, and I think it even encouraged therapists to sleep with their patients, and many other controversial ideas that, you know, floated in the 60s, but not really now, in a sort of ethically conservative environment, for better or worse. And so I kind of adapted that idea, and of course, you know, really it's a grammar for looking and listening, but since sound is always the poor cousin of image in the cinema, and since the sound track is always plays a secondary role to the image, it seemed appropriate to invert that status and invert that hierarchy, to really give the sound person a kind of equal footing with the director or cinematographer, which was myself. So they were really, I really fought for them to be a collaboration with the both of our names in the titles, rather than being a sort of top-down thing. And then the intertitles, which you alluded to, and their sort of taxonomy of ways of describing acoustic phenomena and visual phenomena. I mean, yeah, in a way, there's a kind of absurdity to those, and that's what I like about them. The kind of impossibility of putting a name to these phenomena, you know. It's sort of like trying to understand the world through an encyclopedia. It's you know, it has to be lived.
I mean, if I may, before the reason why when you mention an encyclopedia, when I was looking at it, you know, I didn't know the reference to, or you know, a grammar for living, but when I was looking at it, I was thinking, well, there's something sort of codifying about grammar that you don't have, for example, with encyclopedia, you know, or even, let's say, you know, with a lexicon or something. And you know, like you could have called it an encyclopedia for listening or something like that. Maybe that becomes a little megalomaniac, you know. But you don't use the intertitles in the other two. You have divisions. Well, I guess you have intertitles in the third one. But you just mentioned the places. But in the second one, you just have the color screens that separate the different moments of the film. No?
Yeah. They become the intertitles.
Yeah.
In a way, the colors signifying the different territories and places. And then the third chapter of the grammar has a treatise on listening by Toshia.
Yeah. Lesson.
Yes. So in my case, it's like many of my works, it was just I was trying to find a dignified solution for an absurd commission. So I have done a lot of works in that way, and so I was given money to make a film to contribute to the first biennial of sport in art in Valencia. And so, you know, I had the money, so I had to do something. And I thought, I was thinking about sport, and what kind of thing I could do of a sport that could interest me just a little bit, because I'm absolutely uninterested in sport. And then I came to, of course, I tried to give this twist of the discipline in the body. I think I had been reading too much Foucault at that time, and then I wanted to do something about the discipline in the body, with a turn of cruelty that applied, of course, to the classroom, and the idea of violence as education as violence, and submission, and so I came with this idea of how to teach someone to breathe, which could give this kind of because he had this kind of turn that if you did not learn properly, you would die, and in that way I started to consult breathing exercises, and from the breathing exercises I made a script of 12 how you say exercises. Today, for the first time, I noticed that the 6 was missing.
Yes.
I had never noticed that before, and so
The actress never noticed either.
yeah, no, I didn't. Milano told me, yes, really, the 6 is not there. And
Well, I
so
asked her what happened to the 6th.
yeah,
Well,
exactly.
because I
well,
thought
after-
maybe it was the moment when she moves forward and readjusts
Yeah.
the student, that maybe that counted as the 6th. That was
I think I'm gonna call her 17 years later and say, Anne, what happened to the 6? And well,
Cancel
and
the
then,
check.
yeah, and I think there was as well a lot of the construction was made through the actresses. So the construction of the so I had just this script, and then you know the way we film in the old gallery of Jamot, and the construction of the gallery gave the frame. So that's yeah. You have questions?
No, there's a sort of theatre of cruelty element to it as well. And I was saying to you when I was watching it, it's kind of prescient of, you know, this cult. You know, we have obviously a kind of culture now of mindfulness and learning to breathe again. And I kind of thought that was what it was going to allude to, but then when the breathing turns into a kind of concert for noise, I started thinking about the futurists, or, you know, people like Joan LaBarbera, and this use of the breath as a musical quality to it. And yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, this violence of the interaction between the pupil and the instructor is really kind of fantastic. Like
Yeah,
portrayed.
the body, and when it turns into moaning, when it goes like, yes, that, I mean, I it's too long ago and I don't remember really, but I think it was a lot of input came from the actress who was 12 at that time, and
She's incredible.
yes, he is. Emiliano just said that she became a politician.
Yes, she is. I think I googled her, and she is a politician with the center-right party.
Can you? Yeah.
Pity, huh?
Yeah, I shouldn't have left her.
Maybe it's your
Yeah.
fault.
yeah, you brutalized her.
Yeah. Anyway.
So, but if I, you know, as I was saying, I was trying to think of some relationship between the breathing lesson and some of your other work, and it occurred to me that something that you seem to be very fascinated by in your work, and I was thinking in particular of your piece at the Venice Biennial in 2015, the Santom score, where you have, you know, one person who acts almost as if, you know, he or she were the puppet master, and then you have another person who sort of enacts in one way or another certain commands. Of course, I mean, in, you know, the difference, the main difference, I suppose, between you know, this and the Santom is that that's a performance live, but also the relationship between the two becomes slightly more abstract. You don't quite know how they are related. At least that's what I remember from seeing the piece in Venice a few years ago.
Yes, I think you can see a lot of similarities in all the work I've done. I think all the films I've done, they are film performances. Really, all of them. Some of them closer to theater, some of them closer to performance, visual arts, but it has always been film performance, because there is never a storyboard, there is never a position of the camera. It is always something that is happening, and then the camera just films in whatever way the thing is happening, and there are never repetitions, and there is never rehearsals, so it is really a filming performance. And then the structure of a duo is also repeated all the time in the works, and it is always as well it is never, things are never played for the public. They are always played for each of the performers. So the public is always a kind of intruder that happens to pass by and gets whatever it gets, but it is never made for him or for her or for them.
I mean, I was thinking that when we were watching your film, that really it's quite striking that you're using video in the way that for the advantage and the advantages that video afforded, and the first video artists, this immediate feedback of image and the synchronization of image and sound, and really the filmic is of no consequence, or that's not the intention. Whereas for me, I'm very much interested in using the camera as a tool or as an instrument to investigate perception or investigate different modes of being, and my relationship to the world through the camera. It's an extension of myself.
Yeah, that kind of leads into something that I wanted to bring up, because in a way my other question to you would be like, well, why isn't this also a grammar for scene? But in a way you sort of addressed that already. But I wanted to sort of ask you, how did you, if I understood your answer correct, what you were saying earlier correctly, in terms of the way in which sound always plays second fiddle to the image, and you wanted to invert that and give pride of place to sound, to listening, as opposed to the image and the act of seeing. But then how do you construct the image from the sound? I mean, I can think of some elements, like the way in which the sounds, sort of seem to come at you from different directions. And you see the image as well seems to sort of like fluctuate a little bit. Some things come in and out of focus. This could be, I'm not sure if you had this in mind. There's one shot that I find very beautiful, is the one with the leaf, that at first is just a sort of blur across the image, and then sort of it comes into focus. I think it's a leaf with a caterpillar on it, maybe. And it reminds me strangely of Holbein, of the Ambassadors, where at first you just have this sort of like a strange white thing, but then when you look at it from the right position, you see that it's a sort of a skull that's, exactly, thank you. And, like, what does it mean for you to sort of, construct, what is I suppose maybe the simpler way to ask the question, Luke, is what is the relationship of the image then to the sound, now that the image has become not the sort of, guiding force?
Well, I took a lead from the sound recordists that I worked with, the art field recordists. So it was, instead of me dictating to them in the traditional role that a director says, okay, we need wild track of this and we need this actor recorded, and we need the sound of a dog barking or something like that, to illustrate the story. It was more the act, was a discursive act of being in a place. This was the proposition. We go to a place, and then how do you use your microphone to document this place? And what became apparent very quickly is the deficiency of the camera to record the same level of detail that a microphone can. So a camera can only record when light hits a surface. It can only really record surfaces, whereas a microphone can record depths. It can record beneath the surface. It can record vibration. It can record things that are above and below human faculties of hearing, and then translate them into things that we can hear. So that there's a lot of really interesting analogies between looking and listening. A microphone can obviously record in the dark, keep on going, and so whereas our vision, and particularly camera film's vision, fails us. So there is a reason why the ears are the body's first line of defense, in a sort of primordial way, and we can hear 360 degrees, whereas the camera and the vision are obviously front facing. So I was interested in using the camera to try to simulate some of the ways in which a microphone can be selective of certain phenomena, and really I could only do that with depth of field, depth of focus, and the opening and closing of the aperture. So those were the ways in which I kind of tried to create metaphors for listening, in the frame of vision. If that answers your question.
No, it does.
Or in one way, I could.
No, it does. Because the other thing that's true, of course, is you could also imagine the piece simply as a sound installation without the image. So that's I was sort of curious a bit.
No, when I first was conceiving of the piece, I was thinking a lot about Pierre Schaeffer, who was the originator of musique concrète in Paris in the 40s, in the GRM, and this idea of the acousmatic, of the Pythagorean, not needing to know the origin of the source, and actual to make the sound of interest, or to make it of fascination. So he would sort of use music, sound objects that would then kind of have the same potential as a whole orchestra, but if you were to have seen the sort of meager and humble means in which these sounds were created, then that would have kind of debilitated the imagination, the evocation of the sound world that you perceive is powerful purely because we don't see where the sound is coming from. So what does it mean to then reunite in this if this is a composition, you know, what does it mean to then reunite the source with the sound? Is it redundant, you know, or does it give more depth to the sound?
Well, yes, and also, I mean, at one point you turned to me and you said, you know, I hope this is not giving you migraines, you know. But I saw another video of you with Lee Patterson, and you know, you have the vibrations, and that's, I think, an instrument that he created with a metal plate and some metal springs that you know, he can manipulate, and it's yeah. I think it seemed to me that this is kind of what you were doing, is to sort of, you know, try to find, as you say, sort of visual metaphors for the you know, the sort of fluctuations of sound and the way in which we perceive it, you know. But is it all based on field recordings or no?
Yeah. So there's all of the images. Well, we were in the same place at the same time, and the recordings are all acoustic recordings. They're not processed or recorded outside of. They're diegetic, you know, recordings. We weren't always exactly in the same place of recording. I mean, always, you know, there was no synchronization. And I suppose, you know, the film is kind of a treatise, or a return to the Podovkin, you know, the Soviets, Eisenstein and Podovkin's treatise on our first formulation of sound, the introduction of sound cinema, and what impact it would have. And they gave us warning that we should not have sound following an image in a theatrical manner that was just that recreated actuality, which is obviously the documentary mode, to create actuality, but for sound montage to be a thing of itself, to have its own language that doesn't just reproduce, you know, what's visual montage.
Okay.
You know.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, yes, I was just thinking that of several films, like no one can hear your you scream in space. I mean, when
Alien.
yeah, you know,
When you're in space, no one can hear you scream.
Yes, exactly. A microphone can record in the dark, but it's not very useful in space. And also with the idea of image, an image is image recording also records more than you see. And the famous blow up thing is not, I mean, you probably see it, but since you don't pay attention to it, the possibility that you can see again what you saw allows you to record things that you, or to register things that you didn't. So just I was just thinking of this, no, and the same way to see, when you see a film several times, you always see things that you were not able to see the first time, different things that you. I just wanted to defend a bit the image recording as well. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I continue to use the camera as opposed to a microphone when I make films. So I'm not yet in the realm of sonic cinema.
Yeah, and also, I mean, you can see the image.
Or I'm not quite ready to abandon the camera, you know, for microphone.
I mean, I was going to say, you know, you can see the image as a sort of representation of, you know, of what you see, but you can also sort of turn the thing around a little bit and arrive at a slightly more suggestive idea that that the image is the possibility of seeing the thing in the first place, and not just a kind of representation of what you see. Unless you create the image, you're not really seeing or looking, in a sense. And in a sense, one of the things that sort of crossed my mind as I was watching the film, you sort of become aware of lots of things that perhaps you don't hear, but that in itself, the sort of overload of information it almost sort of makes it hard to hear. It was sort of I had at one point I thought of Pierre Menard,
Funes.
Of Funes, exactly. With because he can remember everything. Borges at the end says, well, he couldn't think. Because but in a way, like if you remember everything, in a way you don't remember anything.
Right.
That's so that I think also kind of complicates a bit the whole idea of this grammar for listening in interesting ways.
Sure. I mean, and there's this acoustic phenomena called the cocktail effect, where basically what we're constantly doing is masking out the sounds that we don't need, that are a distraction from us. And this is sort of analogous to what happens at a cocktail party or in a party, or in a concert. We're trying to, but there's a lot of background noise, but we're kind of concentrating on the person that we're engaging with. And what I suppose you're seeing and listening to there are incredibly wide spatial recordings which don't filter out unnecessary information and focus you in on a specific thing, unless it's the contact microphone, which really is the sort of antithesis of an omnidirectional wide spatial recording. It's purely concentrating on one point source,
And so one of the things, Dora, that I was, this is perhaps a very formal question, but maybe you indulge me, but in, watching the breathing lesson at home on a small computer screen is obviously not the same as seeing it here, but even on the small screen, you're really sort of, struck by the arrangement, and in particular by the gaze of the girl, of the student, let's say, which seems to, as they like to say in French, to really interpellate you as the spectator, because they look straight into the eye of the camera, and this, I think, creates a very slightly disturbing effect on the, especially, as the it's a short film, but it seems to sort of like go very quickly in its the way it kind of ascends until she's almost sort of out of breath, and I guess that ties back to the fact that if you don't learn the lesson, you die, but, what were you, how did you come to this particular, clearly you must have told her, I want you to look straight at, usually you want somebody to be looking a little bit away from the camera, not like straight into it.
Yes, well, there was for the one thing is that she doesn't see the signs of the teacher.
Yes, I was wondering about that.
How is he able to follow them? Obviously, is the teacher that is following the breathing and not the other way around, or there is a mirror. You could also think like the mirror idea was a nice idea because it's very much used for the disciplines of the body. So dancers use the mirror, and every dancer, when they at a certain period in their careers, they stop forcing their bodies. And then one of the things that they are happy is to stop watching themselves in the mirror, because apparently it's really, how you say, the discipline of dancing is very demanding, very painful, and also demands a constant observation of the body. And this is something that fills you with angst. That's what they told me. I don't know, not part of that world. But so I was thinking that this mirror effect, to imagine that there was a mirror in front of the girl, that was something that contributed to the angst of her. But also, since there is no mirror, but there is somebody who's watching the film, so the place of the mirror is occupied by the spectator or the camera. You somehow are accomplice. If you put it a bit dramatic, you're an accomplice in the torment of the girl. Today we were in the canal and I was watching another film of the same period that was the Glass Wall. And I would never do now those films. They are very hard to watch. They are a bit, they're sadistic, and it was very unpleasant. This one is a bit better than the Glass Wall, but you have somehow this idea that actually you are part of this discipline as a viewer, that you are accomplice in the, as I say, in the torment of the girl, and that was the function of the look of her, of course, to a bit like an animal when it's being killed. Yeah.
I wondered, following on from what you were saying about you being an accomplice in this, whether there was also a kind of an analogy between the filmmaker and the relationship between the filmmaker and spectator, of one of control, of controlling the gaze of the spectator. It reminds me of. I'm reminded of a film that videotape that Tony Conrad made. I think it's called Stand in Line, but it was made as a response to. I was fortunate enough to hear Tony give a talk about his work, and he said, made all these films that he felt were liberatory for the spectator. But actually, he came to the conclusion, that, as a result of some sort of criticisms of his films, that really what the spectator wanted was to be controlled. So he made this film where he sort of barks orders at the spectator.
Barks, yeah.
Yeah. It's a fantastic tape. If you haven't seen it, you should see it.
No, I would like, can I use yours? I would like to write down that.
You may use my notebook.
So the name was again?
I think it's called Stand in Line, but Electronic Arts Intermix, EAI, who have his video, represent his video works, will have it. Because it's not a film work, it's like a Stand in Line.
Yeah, but the name of the author?
Oh, Conrad, Tony.
Tony Conrad. Okay. I don't know if you want to open for the public.
This is what I was going to do.
Before everybody leaves.
That's what I was just about to do. So if anybody has a question.
Is anyone still awake?
If anyone's still awake. You do.
Luke, you said in making the film you were trying to answer the question, does the image add anything to the sound? And what was the kind of answer that you came up with?
Well, I don't think I was directly trying. I was being a bit glib there in my response. I don't think I was directly trying to answer that question. I was more trying to pose it for the viewer, and possibly for myself as well. But my own response is it's a very different thing from seeing a work which is purely oral, purely acousmatic. I think it does add something. you know, in many ways, I think there are a lot of covert politics in this film that, you know, in a way, it's a political film, because, you know, what we're also seeing is this, you know, our absences. You know, we're seeing the absence of Glasgow, which was once one of the largest industrial cities, manufacturing cities in the world. So we're seeing an absence in what was in Greenock in Port Glasgow, which what once was one of the busiest docks in docklands in Glasgow. So we're seeing that replaced by, you know, a speedboat and a bit of paper bag, and, you know, you're also seeing birds, you know, just having to live in quite unsettling habitats. Where the site in Manchester is of that 6-lane motorway, the M60, is right next to where Lee Patterson lives, and clearly, you know, the level of noise physiologically has got to have an effect, you know, in terms of like multiple deprivations, right? You stick the lowest down, you stick worse people in the most, or the, you know, the most deprived people in the worst environments. It's the classic thing of like the West. The West is the best because the smoke went to the East. You know, so the posh houses were in the West End. So yeah, I do think that there are things that it opens up, social, cultural and political elements that maybe an purely acousmatic field recording composition perhaps wouldn't open up. It'd be great if the cameraman had a question.
I wonder what equipment did he use?
Yeah,
Like for
because he wants one.
What was it shot on film? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And the macro shots?
We're done with. I mean, this is a Bolex, right? So it's amateur equipment, but they're just basically a little extension tube that you stick between your lens, and all you can focus on is about 2 inches in front of your camera. So it's often very hard to keep focus and follow focus with this macro device stuck to your lens. You end up having the vision of a caterpillar or something, or spider.
And you were working as a one-man band, or did you have
two people? Yeah.
One for sound and one for the camera. Yeah. Okay.
And what about you? You working as a one-man band?
So did Lee do all the sound recordings then? Did you work together
Yes.
on everything?
Yeah.
And how many microphones did he take? And because you have only one camera, but the sound, he can go all around, go in detail, go wide at the same time. So that's also a difference between looking and listening.
Yeah. I mean, in much of the way that, kind of similar way that I used macro lens, he used contact microphones, air microphones. I think it was basically a simple two microphone mid-side setup.
And then in editing and mixing, he has been putting levels together, no? Not at all.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think there is an element of composition going on where he's maybe mixing several
And
things.
adding like sine tones and.
Well, no.
It's
So
it's all recorded.
so
in
it's
places, or-
this sinus-like tone is produced by the vibrating springs that you see.
Really? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Are you a sound recordist? Are you a sound recordist?
No, not at all.
Oh.
Image.
Ah, okay. You seem to have a lot of knowledge.
Could you say a bit more about the choice of locations? I mean, if Lee comes from Manchester, you come from, I guess, Glasgow. I just wondered, and one of the locations was personal to Lee, I guess, round him. And were the others personal to you, or was some neutral? Or
Yeah. Really, it was kind of thinking about this idea of the gift and of reciprocal exchange. So he came to Glasgow, and we filmed in several places that I thought would be interesting for him to record sound in. And so there's Greenock, and then there's lots of which is kind of about half an hour outside of Glasgow, and yeah, there's sort of little Lachlan, small lochs. Is it Lachlan? Lachlan's. Anyway, and then yeah, we recorded in several locations in Manchester around about, including Lee's studio. Yeah, yeah. Studio come bedroom.
Is there any other question? You have another question?
Me? No.
What do you mean?
I'm all out.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the discussion, and thank you very much to you, Dora.